Thank you so much, and a very warm welcome to the delegates and the panelists. It's an absolute delight to have such a brilliant panelist, and I've been working with some of them for a very long time. I think when we are having a session on Govtech, and we were having a conversation with Rajan just before we started this session, and the question was, what exactly is Govtech? And the answer from Amit was, well, it's something that helps in technology, and there are only 5 Govtechs in this country. And Rajan's response was a bit of an exasperation that how can there be just 5 Govtechs in this country? So I think I'll start with what is Govtech, and I'll probably throw that question to Abhishek, because you have been in the center of Govtech and civic tech and so on. So Abhishek, what is Govtech? And among the 100 unicorns that we have, why is it that none of them is Govtech or civic tech or any of these?
Yeah, thank you, Jaijit. And continuing from the discussion that we just had before the start of the panel, first and foremost, I would say that this thinking that there are only 5 GovTech firms, I would not agree with it. GovTech is a much wider space. If we think of only GovTech as companies who are doing core governance work, that number will be very limited and will not be able to exploit the whole potential that remains in GovTech. The way GovTech is, if you look at why GovTechs are not unicorns and why a lot of value, money is not be created, because if you look at only transactional services, if you just look at like services like discovering services and applying for services, scholarships or driving licenses or Aadhaar card or PAN card, so these are like, you will never hit the volumes. Because whenever an investor like Rajan would look into a firm which is doing services, he would look into the numbers, like how many users are there, how many transactions are there. So this driving license, passports are like 1 in a year or 1 in 10 years, these kind of services. You will never reach the transactions. The real value which comes in is by using the core value which the government offers in the form of the data that the government holds and in the form of publishing its APIs. By using the data the government can make enable, and by using the APIs, if you are able to offer value added services which makes the citizen or the user or industry or anybody come back to that portal again and again and avail that services, there we will create the value. An example will be, for example, if somebody is building a more reformed taxation services and help somebody to file the GST returns in a much more efficient manner month after month or quarter after quarter, and there are a lot of SMEs who will be using that services. So the SaaS model comes in. So in that, if any GovTech firm is working closely with government related services by using the SaaS kind of platforms, then they will create value and then people will be willing to pay for that services. If somebody starts working in the agri space, for example, Rajiv Chawla sir is here, he will be talking more about it. But if the government publishes its soil health data, if publishes its crop history data, if the weather data is available, and using that, if you are able to build up an AI advisory which keeps on giving real-time advisory to farmers in their native language, then the farmers will be willing to subscribe to that service. And that will result in transactions month to month, and that will make an agri-tech startup to become a unicorn. Similarly, the health sector, like the way the Ayushman Bharat Digital Health Mission is going, and the way they are building up the basic building blocks and exposing the APIs of the health registries, health service providers, then tomorrow there will be GovTech startups who will be able to offer services like booking an appointment at the AIIMS hospital, or getting a doctor at a low cost, or getting a telemedicine service. So those would also classify as GovTech companies to offer that services. In the DigiLocker project that our team implements, we have published most of our APIs on the apisetu.gov.in. Our 1,000+ APIs are published there. And we have unicorns, we have companies like Upstocks, for example, who are using the APIs to acquire customers. So when you reduce the cost of compliance by ensuring, by working closely with the government and offer a service with which people can avail of that, the cost of the cost of operations goes down, the citizen benefits, and the company who is implementing that solution also benefits. So that's how GovTechs can create value, and when that happens, people like Rajan Anandan would go and invest in them and create, and then they will become unicorns.
I think that's a very interesting take. I mean, government is actually working in multiple sectors. So anybody who's helping the society in those sectors is a GovTech by that definition. I think that's quite interesting. But that brings me to the question, Rajan, that Mr. Khan started his talk by saying that platforms like UPI have scaled up in the last 4 years, and they've done more transactions than what platforms like MasterCard have done in the last 40 years. So the government-backed initiatives have a massive scalability, but we are not seeing that in the startups. We don't have any startup that I can think of which has had even 1/10 of the scalability of a UPI or Aadhaar and so on. So what do you think are the reasons you're holding back such startups, either in the agri sector or any of these civic tech sectors, from scaling up at an India-wide level?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. First of all, congratulations to the team for organizing the first Govtech Summit for startups. I think it's very exciting. I do think, by the way, to the previous question, maybe a more expansive definition, as you were saying, of, maybe some mix of GovTech and civic tech and whatever other, like maybe we should come up with our own terminology for it. Because as I was saying briefly, as a few of us were chatting, if you have only 5 startups, nobody cares. What are you going to go from 5 to like 10? But I do think there's many more when you take an expansive definition, I think there are many hundred. But they all are challenged with a few things, I think, which I'll get to in a minute. But before we get to GovTech startups, I do think this public digital infrastructure, right, has led to many, many unicorns, right? You look at UPI, we've led to many, several payments unicorns. You look at what Account Aggregator and the Open framework are going to do. They're going to lead to many different, digital lending is going to lead to, dozens of new unicorns and so on and so forth. So I do think public digital infrastructure as an enabler, I think 10 years from now, we'll look back. In fact, yesterday or 2 days ago, was it yesterday? I can't remember now, 2 days ago. I was at the National Startup Advisory Council meeting, and Sharad from iSpirit, in partnership with METI, launched this new challenge on how to use, instead of GPS, how do we use our own sort of national tech stack to sort of build use cases for agriculture, right? So I think like this idea of India's public digital infrastructure at scale, at population scale, is probably the single biggest thing the government is doing, right? And then that will lead to lots and lots of interesting companies. But that's sort of one part of it, and we should talk about that. But now coming to sort of what we would, let's say, more narrowly define as GovTech, I think the single biggest challenge is, firstly, we haven't defined it well, so nobody talks about it. I think Amit is the only one who tweets about it. EasyGov tweets about GovTech, and all the people that follow Amit and GovTech basically know what the hell GovTech is. Nobody else knows what it is, right? So I think first is you have to build awareness, right? Like, for instance, let's take agri-tech. Sequoia made our first investment in agri-tech 3 years ago, but if you go back 5 years ago, nobody, except for Omnivore, nobody else was investing in agri-tech. And maybe Sanjay, there were no mainstream investors in agri-tech, right? But today, if you ask me at Surge, which is our early stage program, one of our top 3 folks, I want to find more agri-tech companies, right? Why? Because, it's now clear that you can actually build large-scale companies, right? So in terms of what do you really need? One, I think you want to build awareness, and that's why it's important to get the expansive definition right. And I think this is probably a worthwhile for some combination of Amit, you, and others in this space to define it well, and maybe you give it sort of an Indian moniker that makes it even more interesting. So that's one. I think second, we need to see if 1 or 2 breakout companies, right? Once you see a breakout company, that gives confidence to other entrepreneurs to get into the space and sort of build. But I think the single biggest challenge is funding. EasyGov, I was fortunate to be an angel investor in EasyGov. I'm glad that, Amit and, both of you had a, very good exit to Geo. But it's a damn shame. This is a company that could have been scaled, right? What was the constraint? The constraint was who's going to fund a company where the revenue comes from government? Nobody's going to fund a company that if your revenue comes from 100% of your revenue comes from government, it's very difficult for a venture capitalist to fund that company because how do you there's too many risks associated with revenue. That's the fact. By the way, it's not just an India thing; it's a global thing, right? There have been very few exceptions to that, like Palantir, where large part of the revenue comes from the U.S. government is actually an exception to that rule. They're not the norm. But you have, for instance, other companies like defense companies that get built. So I think the lack of funding, which really simplistically boils down to government revenue, right, is probably the problem to solve. I'll give you. I'm an angel. It's not a Sequoia company, but I'm an angel investor in a company called Gen Robotics. Right, they basically help. There are 4 million scavengers in India, and because they have to go into these manholes, right? Most of them don't live beyond the age of 32. So if 4 million Indians who are scavengers, multiply that by 5, you're talking about 20 million Indians who are in families or households that, which is very, very sad because, they live terrible lives. Anyway, these guys are these 4 young entrepreneurs from Kerala. They built this robot, right? The robot basically, so you train the scavenger now, instead of going into the manhole, you make them a robot operator. It's pretty straightforward. This company has like 25 or 30 crores of revenue. I can't tell you how hard it was for them to raise a round. Like impossible. Like who's going to back a company where your revenue is coming from the Kerala municipalities, the Tamil Nadu municipalities? I mean, it's not easy, right? So, but fortunately, I think they raised the round. It's not announced yet. But man, it took forever. I mean, this company, if that technology, with that team, with that kind of traction, if their revenue came from, let's say, private sector, it would have been funded in total of 80 seconds. 80 seconds. It's that hot. But, you put this one vector, which is, the revenue comes from government. So I think that is the thing to solve. So it's a combination of these things, right? But just like EasyGov. I mean, EasyGov, if there was a different revenue model, right? And the problem is when you build products and services for 1 billion users, I mean, outside of the top 200 or 300 million users, it's very difficult to monetize, as you know. And so you have to find a different way to monetize, and the monetization model was government, right? So I think that's the problem to solve. I think it's a hard problem to solve, so we can get into how to solve it. But one way to solve it, I think, is to have like a dedicated pools of capital. You were there on Tuesday with this National Startup Advisory Council meeting? No, you weren't there. Okay, we had several folks from Nidhi there, but we're thinking about launching, we've recommended launching of sort of dedicated funds, starting with seed funds and then the corpus getting bigger, maybe, climate, agriculture, robotics, and so on, and semiconductors and so on. But, like India probably needs to set aside a few thousand crores, right, to fund these kinds of companies, at least to get them to a point where, they become pretty scaled up companies. So financing, in my mind, is a huge problem to solve because of this complexity of dependence on government revenue. But I think, look, I mean, there is gigantic, I think this whole space, let's just call it expanded Govtech for now. You all will come up with a better term for it. I think it's the single biggest opportunity we have, both for impacting the lives of 1.4 billion people, for improving, accelerating our GDP growth rate, as well as just like real, value of technology applied to real problems. Because let's say like garbage collection, like massive problem, right? Now, I don't know, why do we not have like more garbage collection? I have no idea. Like, you go outside Delhi, you see that, like where they store, I don't know what it's called, but like right there is probably like $10 billion companies. Now, I don't know why they're not being built. I have no idea. But I can tell you, if a company comes to me and says, oh, I'm going to clean up all this, I'm going to create like alternate energy, and by the way, I'm going to have to make money by selling the energy to the Indian government. I love most of that pitch, except that last bit. So I think it's a long answer to your question. I do think it's multiple things, but at least from an investor standpoint, we have to solve this problem. The reality is traditional venture capitalists, if 100% of your revenue comes from government, will not fund that company. I mean, Sanjay, we'll talk about maybe they're different, but at least the many of us will not.
I think that's a great insight into why there's an issue with scalability. Moving to Nidhi on the same basis, you have significant experience in foundation and civil societies in that sense. Why aren't some of them transforming into a profit-oriented initiative? Because that's much more scalable, sustainable. What are the opportunities, and why aren't those opportunities getting transformed to real entities, in the sense profit-oriented entities?
Thanks for that question. Before that, congratulations. I think this is the need of the hour, the conversation that we are having right now. And just to add to what Rajan said, yeah, we need a wider definition. We need probably a more inclusive word. And I think that will also, and more socializing of the concept, because, to what you've said, this work in terms of working in the area of civil society or any kind of impact is not new to the country or to the world. This has been happening from a non-profit point of view for decades now. And yes, the non-profits have been a very, very, very important part of helping the government to achieve a lot of impact in the country. But for ages, this has not been sustainable because it has been coming from a very philanthropic point of view. It was always about, okay, you're trying to bring a change, you're trying to do something good for the society, trying to support the government, so it should not come at anything in terms of profit. That is where a lot of social enterprises, a lot of startups who are now in this area, whether it's about waste management, it's about EdTech, it is about skilling. A lot of them are now looking at it from a very sustainability point of view. You cannot bring a change in this world unless your proposition is sustainable. That is where, whether you are a non-profit or you are a for-profit organization, unless your whole strategy is about making it economically sustainable, it would be very short-term kind of an impact. And I think my favorite example right now, since we also spoke about it some time back, is Hak Darshak. I think that's one story that I've seen where they are bringing a lot of government schemes and all of that, making it accessible for people at the grassroots level. In fact, NASSCOM Foundation is planning to do a lot of work in aspirational districts with them. And how that model has a completely revenue-driven model where it is looking at a social problem from bringing a change, but also looking at how to make that company, that enterprise, and the community sustainable, economically sustainable. So I think the kind of problems that we are talking about today, unless you look at it from a for-profit point of view, and I think we need to stop being apologetic about it. If we are wanting to support the country, the government, and it's okay to earn money on it, and that's the reason that a lot of innovation. In fact, we run a lot of innovation ideas in college levels, where we are trying to get ideas on social innovation, where people at the college level can start thinking about solutions, again, whether it's about agriculture, it is about access, it is about again, climate, waste management. We are bringing in a lot of ideas, innovation solutions where they can start young and allow them to think about profit. And profit from a point of making the solution, the whole access, everything more sustainable. Yeah, so that is the reason I think unless the startups, and even that's the whole concept behind social enterprises. It's not NGO. It's not a non-profit organization. It is a social enterprise which is bringing a solution to bring a change or to talk about in terms of progress, but it is also looking at from a profit point of view. Yeah.
Very interesting. I think that's a great message. We don't need to be apologetic about being for profit because somebody has to pay at the end of the day. If they don't pay, we are paying as taxpayers. Based on what Rajan and Nidhi was saying, I have a long-winded question for you, Anuj. So what Rajan said is that at the end of the day, there is the government which is paying, and that becomes a high-risk proposition, but 20% of all procurement in any economy is government. So willy-nilly, many of the entities which supposedly are selling to B2B entities are eventually also selling to government. The reason I'm going down this path is that for about 20 years, I've been tom-tomming that the government should be going for outcome-based procurement. And one of my favorite examples was that in this hall, we are maintaining 24 degrees centigrade. Why do we buy and procure an AC? We should only buy 24 degrees centigrade. You can do it in whichever way. You can put more, more panels so that heat doesn't get transferred. You can use air cooling. You can use whatever new technology that you may want to. And therefore, in the context of the manual scavenger that Rajan was talking about, instead of the government buying the robot, can the government buy scavenging as a service? And therefore, we can sell the robots to such entities. So what are your thoughts, being on the other side, trying to sell services? Would it make sense for the government to switch to an outcome-based procurement? Instead of buying roads, can they buy a serviceable entity on which cars can travel so that every 6 months they don't need to break down the road and rebuild it again? The service should be that you should have a road there. So what are your views on it, Anuj?
Yeah, thanks. I think you have already told my views, right? With question, you also, answered it. No, I totally agree with you. So I think a government procurement is very prescriptive, right? I mean, they exactly define what goods and services they want. And that actually limit innovation because once you know what you are procuring, I mean, then there is no scope left for innovation. So if you go for outcome-based specifications where you just define the problem, like you said, I just need to define that I need the 24-degree or maybe 22-degree with 50-degree outside, right? Rather than specifying all the details of I need this AC of this much ton and this size, and so once you leave, once you define the problem and leave the solution to the startup, they can come up with a very alternative approach, right? Which could be maybe it could give you a less carbon footprint and all those things, right? So to drive innovation, I think it's very important that government come up with the outcome-based specifications so that new players or startups can actually think, right, and then come up with those innovative solutions. Secondly, I think it will solve another problem. One issue is how I'm able to sell my solution, but the bigger issue in government is, are we able to successfully implement it? So what I've seen is that in prescriptive, kind of specifications, you executely define those 10-step process, which you want to go through. So the focus is not on the outcome, but on the process. So even if I take a new technology which is data-driven, has all the AI and other things, but when it goes to the government official, they'll say, no, I exactly want to do like this because I have specified this in my RFP. So if we go for this outcome-based, you actually speed up the implementation as well. And secondly, as you rightly said, de-risk the whole process, because a lot of time government don't want to give the project to startup thinking that they'll not be able to implement it. But if it is an outcome-based, model where if I able to, bring that temperature to 24-degree, I should get the payment, right? So I think it benefits everybody, the government, the vendor, as well as it will speed up the whole, implementation. Right?
Yeah, then a robotics company can sell to the service provider, the robots, rather than trying to align to the specific requirements. In fact, I've seen RFPs which says the service provider should be in any quadrant of the Gartner quadrant, which is just a, if it was geopolitics, I would have called it a non-tariff trade barrier. So those kind of limitations. I think you have got a point to add to that.
Yeah, no, since you mentioned about Gartner, so I think we need to define our own. We should not be worried about and put restrictions like it should be 100 crore turnover, or you should have done 20 implementation. If I've done 20 implementation, then it's not an innovative product, right? It's an innovative product. Then you should be ready to relax. And then I think outcome-based pricing solve all those because you're focused on outcome, not on these kind of terms and conditions.
Yeah, I think that just reminds me of Arjun looking at the eye of the fish and saying, that's what I want. Abhishek, that brings me to the point that for a long time, the government has been talking about open data. In fact, the conversation got triggered by Obama's visit, I think around 2011-12, that was the time period. And with a lot of enthusiasm, the government went ahead and put a lot of open data for people to look at. We've been trying to look at that data, both from an academic perspective and from a commercial perspective. And it seems that one is not able to really crack much out of the data because there is no continuation either from a time series perspective or a geographic perspective. And we have seen this globally. Globally there was a wave that government data should be opened up, which will lead to a lot of startups happening, new ideas coming in, but none of that happened. Why do you think that that's not happening, and what is it that the government should do to make that data much more effective? Because we're losing national wealth. Every time we are not able to extract something from a structured data, we're losing national wealth. How do we enable that from the government perspective?
Very relevant. In fact, Jaijit, you have kind of identified the core issue that we're grappling with and we're trying to solve. Because, of course, the open data portal, data.gov.in, was launched way back in 2012 when Department of Science and Technology, incidentally, had come up with a national data sharing and access policy. But if you look back at the implementation of the NDSAP policy, and if you look at the functioning of the open data portal, which has got more than 500,000 data sets and a lot of high value data sets also there, millions of downloads, other things. And yes, so we have been for the last 6 months, we have been reviewing the overall deficiencies or the gaps that are there on the data portal. And in fact, we worked very closely with NASSCOM. And some of the best data analytics company, in fact, Shrikant from Fractal was working with us along with a whole team of industry representatives who looked into 2,000 high-value data sets on the data.gov.in portal, and we went deep into where are the gaps. Somewhere we didn't have the time series data, somewhere we didn't have the geographical spread, somewhere the standards, the metadata standards which are laid out were not followed, which made it very difficult for any user to use that data. So based on that feedback, we came up with a with the concept of what we called it the India Data Accessibility and Use Policy, which was put up for public consultations in February. And we have got a lot of inputs and all, and based on that, the National Data Governance Framework is being published, which should be done within this month. And what it does is that it addresses the gaps that were there in the implementation of the India Data Portal. What was the biggest problem was there was that while the policy required all government departments to ensure that they classify all their data into 3 categories, open, restricted and prohibited, but there was no institutional mechanism to look into how various government departments are implementing it. So this, the new framework that we have done is coming up with the concept of India Data Management Office, which will be like an entity which will be tasked with the responsibility of ensuring that every public authority, every government department which holds any data of a citizen or of any entity in a fiduciary capacity makes it available in an anonymized format with privacy protection norms for anyone to use it. So that India Data Management Office, once it sets up, it will address some of the concerns which are there right now. The other thing that it proposes to do is to set up data management units within government departments, because what again the NDSAP policy asked every department to designate somebody in each department as a chief data officer. So like agriculture would go ahead and designate a joint secretary or give an additional responsibility of being a chief data officer, but he was not supported by any PMU or any data experts. So now in this framework and in this implementation that we have started, what we are saying is that each chief data officer will be supported by some data scientists and data analysts who will be able to look into it, what is the data that we are publishing, what is the data we are going to give in, and once this whole framework is set up, we're also thinking of can we go into a regime wherein data will be available to anyone on demand. So, so just like under RTI, people can ask for information and get it from a public authority unless it's prohibited. Similarly, if the entire backend system is set up, the data portal is set up, the data management office is set up, and the data units in various government departments is set up. So tomorrow, if a startup wants a particular data which it feels that the government, some government authority has it, then can a government authority give that data in the defined format on the portal or to the entity within a defined time frame? Because that would really change things the way we look at. Because these days, for example, we are looking at something like this 10-minute delivery system services are there. And anyone who is building a 10-minute delivery would definitely want the information with regard to where are the location of the speed breakers, where are the traffic lights, what is the time duration which is there on each traffic light system. So if this data is held by the traffic police department or the public works department, if this data is made available on a public portal for anyone to use, then anyone who is building this solution can design that solution better. So that's the data regime we need to go in, and once the data governance framework and policy comes in, then we will be able to address this challenge to a great extent. Just one small point to what Anuj had mentioned with regard to startups not getting to compete in RFPs and RFPs requiring conditions with regard to turnover and with regard to experience of previous projects. I would just like to mention that DPIIT has and Ministry of Finance had relaxed these norms, and today startups can bid for projects and take projects even if they are exempted from turnover criteria and experience criteria also. And we are seeing many startups competing in this space and getting projects. And to one small point to what Jaijit had mentioned in the earlier question to Anuj, is that some procurements the government is also doing on the outcome based and even challenge around procurements. Because in 2020, for example, when the pandemic struck and we were looking for a video conference solutions, because all of us were dependent on Zooms and Teams, and we were told by the highest authorities that why don't we have an Indian system for video conferencing when the entire government is functioning on that. So that time we came up with a challenge round, and therein the prize money of that challenge round, the hackathon, the innovation challenge, was not just a prize money, it was a government contract. So we came up with that model, and a company from Kerala was selected, the first tech agency who has built the Bharat VC solution, which the entire government is using now for its video conferencing meetings. And the second entity, which the 4 companies which are selected, the other company was Jaipur-based ServWebs, and their solution, video conferencing solution, is being used by income tax department for their faceless assessments, honoring the honest. So those contracts are also happening. Those models are there. Where we define outcomes, we define challenges, we allow our startups to compete with and to build products which the government will procure as a contract at the end of that. And that contest, especially, I would again, anyone participating in that innovation challenge was not even required to be registered as a startup. it said that even if there are some college students who are trying to build a solution, if they get up to the prototype stage, then they will have to register as a startup within the next 3 months or something. So those models are also there for procurements.
I think that must be music to the ears to all the startups who are sitting here. I think that's very, very forward-looking. Some quick points. In fact, just for everybody else, the toilets that you see in New Delhi Municipal Council, the smart toilets, we actually procured them through challenge. And the advantage was, the reason why we did it was not for saving money, but for the time constraint. If you go through a tender process for just the design, it will take more than 8 to 9 months. And how do you evaluate design? Because there is no criteria for evaluating design. So we finished up the smart toilets within 2 months of actually starting up the project. So a lot of learnings from what's happening in the government. But the second point also is that along with the data, if you can connect it to some of the path-breaking systems that Karnataka has been doing in terms of consent framework, where even if you anonymize the data, if somebody's consent is needed, that'll be quite useful to do.
The consent is the core of the thing, and METI had also come up with its consent framework, and operationalizing that, Karnataka has built up a model in which consent of the citizens is taken, and that is going to be the core of any service that we do, and especially with the health mission coming in, wherein electronic health records will come in, and wherein there will be sharing of record from one entity to the other. So consent will have to be at the core of whatever we build in this space.
Right. I think that sounds great. But as Major Batra once said before he scaled the next peak, Dil Mange More. The data that comes in open Gov data is kind of static. And there's a question to Rajan actually, is that it'll be far more valuable if you can plug it into the government systems on a real-time basis and generate value, exactly like so many startups are doing over IRCTC data, right? They're building on top of IRCTC data. They're predicting whether your ticket will be confirmed or not confirmed, and that's of huge value. The government has actually adopted a policy called Open API policy. And from the Center for Digital Economy Policy Research, we did a research which showed that if all of the systems in government have Open API, then the GDP impact will be 5%. It will grow up by 5%. So Rajan, you have been in the thick of things from the startup side and from the innovation side. How important do you think is having an open API, and how will it really impact the startup ecosystem? And in fact, one of the examples Abhishek gave was Upstock, which is also feeding off government systems and doing really, really well. So Rajan, what are your views on that?
I think it's very important. I think the more data you can open up, I think the more opportunities that you create for companies to be built. I think there's no question. I mean, I think we should figure out how to do all that maybe faster. I think government's doing that, already. And in terms of companies that will get created, right, there's sort of companies that are more private sector focused, like Upstock is a private sector company, leverages the data, right, and you build, and there'll be other companies that leverages the data where the revenue model will depend on. Look, at the end of the day, like especially if you want to build a venture funded company, right? By the way, you can also build non-venture funded companies. I don't know how many of you know the two most profitable startups in India have not raised any capital, right? So Zerodha and Zoho both have, I think, over 2,000 crores of net income per year and haven't raised a single paisa of external capital. And Zerodha is only 11 years or 12 years. They founded in 2010. So, so I think one of the things that's happened with startups also is, that you have to raise capital, right? So maybe the best way to build these GovTech and C-Tech companies is you bootstrap them through these government contracts, and you kind of continue to build those, and it'll take you a little longer to sort of build. So anyway, coming back, I think with this very, very important. I think the private, companies that can leverage the data to build sort of normal private sector. When I say revenue models don't depend on government kind of companies, I think those are straightforward. I think the problem that we should solve though is what I mentioned in the first time, which is, when you have to depend on the government for revenue. By the way, I like the idea of this idea of, give me 24 hours, give me 24 degrees Celsius, right? And then you can figure out, but the problem is still you have to pay me. So that's the question, right? How do you put some certainty around the fact that...
No, unless I go to a startup and find a solution.
No, what I'm saying is like, that startup still has to get paid, right? So the question is who's paying? Like you almost need like a sovereign, like sovereign bonds are attractive because there's a guarantee, right? Maybe there's some way you can certify companies and, I mean, what is the concern that investors have, okay, when you have to depend on government's revenue? One, it takes a really long time to get a deal. Maybe that gets shortened by what you were describing. Number two, I don't know whether I'm going to get paid or not. Okay? And the fastest way to kill a revenue generating company is to pay them in 120 days. You're dead. So, you know, like, those are the things you have to figure out how to solve, which is, and maybe we should just look at, like, Palantir, right, in the US, which is, you know, Decacorn now. And how is it that they were able to, investors in Palantir were able to get comfortable that, and maybe because, you know, the Defense Department and, you know, others, maybe they have a track record of paying on time and so on and so forth. But I think it's something for, you know, like for us to collectively as an ecosystem think about and then work with the government to get some comfort. And maybe it's just a lack of data, right? Maybe every single startup that has done government with business has always got paid on time. Like, I would love to see the data. Let's forget about open data. If you want to really drive innovation, like, show me the data. How long does it take to get paid? What percentage of the time do they get paid on time? How long does it take to get a contract done? You know, like that kind of, because, you know, if you get more comfortable, like if you come back and say, hey, you know what? 100% of startups that have done business with the government of India, both at the center and the states, get paid on time. Whoa, that's cool. Like, what's the data, by the way? Do we have the data? So we should do that. Anyway, I'm answering more than your question you asked me, because I keep coming back to this. I've thought a lot about why do these, because I have personally invested in a bunch of these companies. You know, so I've seen this movie. Now I sit on the other side as an investor, and I'm like, whoa, I can understand why these companies never raise money. But maybe there's some data that shows, I mean, it'd be helpful to understand, like, what percentage of companies get paid on time, and what's the average time to get paid?
No, absolutely. Well, Abhishek, why don't you go ahead and add?
Just to add to this point, in fact, this problem we have been grappling with for some time. And again, Finance Ministry, again, last November or December, they have issued an order which defines the time frame for making payments to any service provider to the government, startup or otherwise. And they say that if the bill is raised, within 2 weeks they need to be paid. And if they are not paid, then the government will be entitled to pay an interest on the amount which is due.
Somebody should launch a company just to go measure that.
That's what. So the challenge will be in ensuring that this is implemented. I tried doing this in one of the contracts which I was running in FCI for the Depot Online project, and my finance, they jumped on us. I said, like, if we are having SLAs for the service provider to meet SLAs, and if it doesn't meet the SLAs, I impose a penalty, can we have SLAs on us also, that if he does the job, and if he's done satisfactorily, and he's raised the invoice, if I don't pay it within time, can I pay interest on it?
Abhishek, company's dead. You don't have to have an SLA. You don't pay them, they don't, you know what I mean? Like, it's like...
So if the reverse SLA functions and this becomes like kind of a policy which is enforceable, then maybe part of this problem that you have mentioned can get resolved.
No, but this is interesting, right? Like, where is the data? Like, what percentage of, what is the compliance to these 2 weeks? I mean, that would be amazing if somebody showed us the data that said, hey, you know, 100% of companies that do business with the government of India now get paid in 2 weeks. Whoa, everything changes. Maybe we should, Amit, we should run a Twitter poll. Put a Twitter poll out there. You know, let's get some data.
Currently it will be near to zero, but yes.
Near to zero. There you go. That's why companies don't get funded. You know, there's a big difference between 0 and 100.
So clearly, I think there's a challenge, and for sure the government is trying its best to do to reduce the issue, because there's also a TradeX platform where you can do bill discounting and so on. So there is a way to get the money out, but it's challenging. It's always been challenging, even for large companies. Forget about small companies. But that's a very interesting comment you made about SLAs, Abhishek, and that brings me to a question for Nidhi. Nidhi, all of these entities and these 5 companies that Amit spoke about are essentially a layer between the government and the citizens, right? Which is where Rajan suggested, why don't we expand that definition? But let's just look at these 5 companies. They cannot provide a service unless there is a back-to-back SLA guarantee from the government, right? And I've heard of cases in Haq Darshak where their representatives get beaten up in the village because they said we'll get you the pension, but the government did not deliver that pension, and they catch hold of this person saying you are responsible because you took that 50 rupees, 100 rupees, whatever the case may be. So how important is SLA, and how do you really ring fence these startups, and how can they manage this situation, Didi, given that you have a ringside view of what's going on?
You know, that takes me to I've been in the sector for about 2 decades, and right from the beginning, there was, even in the non-profit sector, there was always a thing that work in partnership with the government, don't take money from the government, and don't take commitments from the government, okay? So use their support in terms of their stance and credibility, but do not. And I think even in the startup space, like, as you mentioned, the Hagdarsha example, the challenge continues to be the same. And what Abhishek was saying right now, that, yes, there are certain procedures to fasten the whole thing done, but then within that, there are a lot of complications within. And while there is a commitment and maybe a willingness in the government to change the process, we are dealing with, again, decade-old systems and mindset and people's thinking, which will, I'll give you an example. I don't know if it's relevant out here, but a visit to a passport office. I was surprised that I uploaded the document in DigiLocker and they still wanted printouts. Right? And that is completely where I was taken aback. I wasted 2 hours because of that, because I did not have the printouts with me. And so that is where, the accountability from the government, there has to be, yes, what Abhishek is saying, if it's possible to penalize the government for something like this, it would, but it's not possible, I'm pretty sure of that. But yeah, it does discourage a lot of parties, a lot of partners to actually work on behalf of the government programs and schemes, because this is something which is now out in the open, because there's some companies who are for-profit who could be talking on social media and Twitter could be more active on it. But this is a challenge that NGOs have been facing for years, that you take government schemes, you take government policies, you take government programs on the ground. One, you don't get paid for years. And second, you give commitments on schemes to the people on the ground, but it doesn't happen. You say that a particular loan is possible, you try and work with NABARD on it, you try and work with other bank structures on it, but it takes years to deliver on that. And that, again, it's a very common thing when I'm sure that even the Govtech startups face the same problem. When you go at the community level, and you promise something to the people who are probably from the rural areas who do not know enough, and you say that this is possible, and when it's not possible, it leads to a lot of defeat in them, and saying that it's kind of something that nobody can bring a change. So definitely, yes, it's even what Abhishek was saying. If it starts there, I would just say that one step at a time. We can't bring in change overnight. And even that one step of allowing a startup to bid without having the usual RFP things is something, definitely a start there. But at the same time, even if, again, going back to Hagdarsha example, it is possible, it's been possible for an organization like Hagdarsha to reach out to millions, because they were getting that support from the government. The government gave them access to data. The government gave them access to information and schemes. How else would they find it? So we have to acknowledge the fact that it's slow, but there is work happening there. But yes, in terms of accountability systems, which the government has to be answerable for, those need to strengthen, definitely. Yeah.
Oh, very interesting. Abhishek, I thought you want to make a comment on the passport example.
I was surprised, because that's one of the functionality that we got MEA to agree with it, and DigiLocker APIs are integrated with the passport application. So like when you're applying for the passport, you can pull your DigiLocker documents authorized, then you don't need to submit your proof of date of birth or or your address. So that way it's done, and it should not have been. So it's like more of an awareness issue, and it's also only points out, this example points out that we need to work more on training and change management issues in order to orient the person at the counter that this functionality is there, it's recognized by Ministry of External Affairs, there are orders for that, so you should abide by that. And this, because the similar functionalities we are building in academic certificates, like with the National Academic Depository, you can verify academic credentials without having to submit a PDF or a paper certificate. So this would require a lot of advocacy work, I think, from our DigiLocker team to ensure that citizens don't face such hardships.
I would just add to that, I'm an educated and aware person, and I face this problem. But definitely, in terms of making anything accessible to the larger masses, what we say to the Bharat, I think a role that is very important, and that's where organizations like NASSCOM Foundation are playing a role, about making the world digitally literate and aware. I think that is the game changer. There is access, but people need to understand that access. People need to, be digitally literate. We are saying that we are a 70% literate company, but when it comes to digital literacy, we are very, very poor on that. So I think that is something we can make any kind of platform, we can make any kind of GovTech startups, but unless the Bharat is literate, digitally literate, that change will not come because people need to be aware about it.
Well, let me just add one piece of information that passport. They take 10 rupees per printout or per photo. Yes. So you can explain, you can understand the motivation why they do not understand what MeIT is telling you. Totally defeating the purpose. So, that brings me to the issue of what you in fact said, Abhishek, about challenge-based procurement. It's a one-off that happens, and that too we get the clearance from the highest offices to get that done. We did the same for these smart toilet procurements. Anuj, in terms of these Swiss challenge that was actually incorporated into the GFR, and therefore it's part of the procurement process, why is it that we have not seen this Swiss challenges happening? And it's so core to procurement in an institutionalized basis, not a one-off basis, but on a continuous basis. Why can't we have Swiss challenge procurement?
What is that maybe for?
So what Swiss challenge basically means, Rajan, and for others who would not know the jargons, is you can actually go and propose that there's a new thing I'm doing, and there is no precedence to it, nobody else has the technology or the wherewithal, and therefore please don't ask for a three-party bid. But what you can do is you can go and put it up and say, is there anybody else who can provide it at a cheaper cost? Right? And so if there's somebody who says, yes, I have exactly the same thing, I can provide it cheaper, then that person gets it. Otherwise, you get it without any other bids coming in. So that's a Swiss challenge, roughly speaking. There are obviously much more nuances to it, but that was adopted. And I think it's a fantastic mechanism for procuring innovation within the government. A lot of governments attempted. Madhya Pradesh government attempted, pre-splitting of Andhra and Telangana, the Andhra government attempted, but none of them succeeded. And I think it's a huge drag on startups, GovTech, civic techs, and so on and so forth. So, Anuj, over to you. You have been dealing with this situation for a long time.
Yeah. So I'll not go into specific of why those governments were not successful, because there are a lot of other things beyond technology, right? The fear and of of watchdog and all those things. But ideally speaking, I mean. Or the root cause of all this is we have to map the innovation to the need. Like Abhishek said, right? When there was a need for the video conferencing, we were able to procure by throwing a challenge. So what I've seen in the government, if there is a will, they find a way, right? So what we need to do is, I think, publish more and more of these kind of needs so that startups can actually, or before even I go to that, right? Why is government sector attractive? The kind of complex problem they have, it is very attractive to a startup, because if I'm able to solve that problem, I can actually monetize and give it to all over the world. If you see, a lot of innovations has happened from the government requirements, and then you monetize and give it to the private, right? So the sector is very attractive. I mean, what we need is, like, if you can publish all the needs, not only your needs, what you need now, but maybe next in 5 years. Because to develop innovative project, solutions, it takes maybe months and years, right? If I exactly know what government is thinking, what kind of a, challenges they have, what they will be requiring in next 5 years, if you publish that kind of a need, me as a startup can develop a solution, I can map my, technology to the need, and then I can go and say, okay, now you throw a challenge, or, you procure through Swiss challenge, whichever way, right? That's the first thing. Second thing, I mean, the short-term thing which I need is you have to find a person like Chawla sir, who understands the technology and the complexity of government setup, so that he can map your innovation to the need and help you navigate and articulate, right? I mean, so the issue is that mapping of that innovation to the need. It should not be from innovation to need. It should be from need to innovation. Right.
No, I think again, very, very interesting. So, Abhishek, what's your advice to startups in the GovTech space? You've had it's almost like most of the projects are flowing from your office and through your fingers, the large projects. So what is the advice to GovTech startups for them to be successful and for them to successfully engage with the government with sufficient profitability? Because what also happens, they do engage and they do sell projects but at a loss and they're not able to make money. So how can they be profitable ventures and how can they successfully engage with the government?
Very interesting but challenging question. See, it's not going to be easy, first and foremost. So what I would feel and what I would do is that startups would need to kind of move away from trying to be totally dependent on the government. When I say that, if you limit to what the government is doing and trying to automate it and trying to make it available through an app or through an online mode, that's not enough. You have to think of being innovative on it. The government is offering something. Based on that layer which the government is offering, like the Aadhaar or the UPI or the DigiLocker or the APIs that the government has published, more than 1,000 APIs are published. How can you build a value-added service on that? And therein innovation will come in. How do you think of interlinking services? Instead of looking into a silo-based, I'm building only for agriculture, how do we link agriculture to, say, healthcare or to rural development? Can we think of looking into if somebody has access to the Rural Development Ministry database, and he says that like if we know that somebody in a village is a Manrega beneficiary, can that person also get an Ayushman Bharat health card? So that kind of innovation very often doesn't happen in the government because government works in silos traditionally. We are trying to break that, but the process of doing something in the government innovative is much longer. If startups can think of innovatively and try to cut across silos and build interconnected services, they will be able to build a revenue model to it. Why will a farmer subscribe 100 rupees per month for a service? There has to be value for the farmer. And if you can derive that by building some applications around, it will create value for that. There are startups which are working on the urban mobility space, smart city space. Can we link it up to carbon credits? Can we ensure that if a municipal body, if you are building a solution for a municipal body, and municipal body is offering online services, which is reducing the number of people who are coming to a physical office, and in a way their fuel consumption and the energy consumption is going down, can that municipal body earn carbon credits? And today there are companies across the world who are building such solutions. These solutions cannot be thought in the government because government's innovation capacity, thinking out of the box, is very limited. We are very often scheme driven. We are very often limited to what the mandate is given. To think across is not there. So if a startup can think of that, can think of building those solutions, can think of offering those solutions, it will result in value not only for the startup but for the government office also, for the citizens also. Within the government, like if you look at and another challenge with government, startups working with the government is that government is itself a competitor. Like today, because of the challenges of procurement and because of challenges of managing change requests, which comes from even big companies which are implementing IT solutions, what has happened is today, many of the government departments across states and government departments, we are building our own solutions. Like if you look at a GEM portal, now, GEM is a startup in a way, with a more than $1 trillion revenues, $1 trillion turnover every year. If you look at DigiLocker with 5 billion documents with 100 million users, it is a startup. But then again, these are being done internally by the government. So how do the startups engage with such entities within the government? MyGov, citizen engagement platform, it does a lot of citizen communications, but because it's within the government, we don't have a monetizing policy. We struggle with our own funding, with our internal finance and all. So the challenges we startup face with VCs, we face internally with our finance to get money for our own projects. If we can somehow break this and try to work out a model in which startups and entrepreneurs can work with the government in addressing the challenges the government faces, bringing in innovation, building in solutions which did not exist, thinking beyond what is given, then a lot of value can be created.
In fact, Abhishek, there actually is a startup which converts the carbon credits into an NFT and then sells it in an NFT market, and they work with government. So exactly what you're pointing out, it's very, very
NFTs, I'm not sure whether we need to go into NFTs or not, but even carbon credits. Like how many government departments today know how do we measure their carbon footprint? And if they are able to measure it, and if they are able to show whether their carbon footprint is going down, and if they can monetize, if they can trade those carbon footprint, that itself will be value.
And that's a trading platform. The NFT becomes a trading platform because the market opens up. Now, I think that's an interesting point, Abhishek, you're making. What you're saying is that use government to actually target the private, the larger civil society, and that's exactly what Rajan was also saying. So Rajan, then coming back to you, if that's what's happening, if that's where startups can get a leg up in that sense, because they'll get existing systems to stand on, will they be getting significant funding if they just use government as an infrastructure but not as a market?
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think, by the way, these ideas are really good. I think this challenges, first of all, is a superbly interesting idea, right? Maybe what we should do is have more challenges, because if that's a way to get innovators to focus. Also, we should make our prizes more. You know, like what was the challenge? What's the prize for the challenge for the video, the Zoom competitor?
We gave it like a crore for the contract for 3 years.
Right.
Yeah, that was a bit.
Yeah.
But then we benchmarked it with the
Like, let's make it really interesting, no? Like, 1 crore to power video of the Indian government, a democracy of 1.4 billion people. You know, let's what I'm saying is, look, I love the idea of challenges, but let's get one way to, so firstly, I really like this idea. I hadn't thought of the challenge. I'd heard of a few of them, but I think the more I hear both of you speak, all three of you speak, I think challenges is super interesting. But let's make the price of the challenges also very significant and tie it with these long-term contracts. Like for instance, right, like if there was a challenge and you say build this and you have let's just make up a number, okay, 10 crore, 100 crore, 5-year contract. All of a sudden, that's interesting. Right? Okay, maybe you won't get paid on time, whatever. So I think that was one. I think the second one, to your point, is maybe the answer is you can't really only depend on government. So you have to build your company in such a way where you get the jump start of the government, as you were saying, as both of you have been saying, but really focus on private sector. So actually, I just thought of it. So for Gen Robotics, maybe the way we should think about it is this scavenger robot is the first product, and you get your 20 or 30 or 50 crores or whatever the number of revenue is. But at the end of the day, we're a robotics company. Okay? Our goal has to be to build robots for the private sector. So we got the jump start on the technology, on computer vision, whatever, blah, 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 of this, right? But it has to be broader. And maybe Amit, and both of you, if you apply that lens to EasyGov, how could EasyGov have morphed differently, right? Because today I think the notion has been it works, there's 1 billion people, try to scale it to 1 billion people. Maybe that's not the approach. So you have to think about these, I think both are superbly interesting ideas. But no, we'd be very comfortable, right? If a founder came and pitched to us saying, hey, look, we want this challenge, because of this, we've got a X crore, whatever contract, right? We're going to bootstrap this, but we've got some ideas of how to monetize outside from the private sector or from customers or businesses or whatever. I think it's getting very interesting. I mean, we should take some of whether it's the EasyGov definition of 5 or the broader expansive definition of 450. This number probably lies somewhere in between, right? Maybe we should take 4 or 5 of these companies and really engage deeply to say, how would you change the strategy to make it to what we're talking about, right? And maybe use that as a way to launch some challenges. So, you really have to look, everything in life is the power of one. The day there is one GovTech or Civic Tech unicorn in India, everything changes. And especially now, it's going to be really hard to be a unicorn because you're going to have real revenue. 2022 is not 2021. 2021, all kinds of things happen. 2022 is back to reality. By the way, 2021 was the anomaly. So 2022 is more like 2019. So I think if we can just get one, right, and really put our minds to how do we identify 4 or 5 companies, work with them, build some challenges, get them to change their strategy. It's very interesting because the more I think about it, I think it's unreasonable to think that, the government, but by the way, Indian government is the most progressive when it comes to startups. We have the fund of funds, we have all this public digital infrastructure, we have Startup India, we are doing so many things, right? So it's probably not fair, to ask for more change. But I think this challenges, how much does the government of India spend on challenges today?
quite a bit now.
Like how much? Well, what's the quantum?
Maybe across, if we include Startup India,
Yeah, all challenges, yeah.
around 500 crores.
500, so we should get that number. And maybe 500, so if you say, look, we're going to spend, 500 crores is a lot, by the way. We should also measure ROI now on this, challenges, But let's say 500 crores, maybe it's 1,000 crores, whatever. Like you say, we're going to set aside X thousand crores per year on these challenges and really make sure they are, like this, I can tell you this thing that Sharad launched with METI on, and ISRO, METI and iSpirit, right? This challenge that was launched, Navic. Like if that works, that's a company we'll fund, for sure. Because it's agri-tech, it builds off digital infrastructure that we're going to have. So there's lots of interesting things about that.
In fact, that Navic chip itself has a huge history, right? METI was involved trying to procure the chip, the $8 versus $1 issues up. So the government has been, to your point, Rajan, government has been continuously trying. But the checks and balances are also sacrosanct. Right? So it's a very challenging situation But it's great to see that we're moving forward in that situation.
I mean, if we already have, we should get the number. If it's truly 500 crores, that's the other thing we should do, right? Even like we should talk about these things more. Because I think we do a lot of these things and, you know, like small, like I spend every waking moment on startups. Like I had no idea 500 crores was being spent on challenges. I get all my startups to apply for these challenges, you know?
No, absolutely. And I think, Rajan, I think those challenges are small token challenges. So when you add up, it's probably is 500 CR, but it's small, it doesn't have the impact. If you compare that with, let's say, the Ansari X Prize, the X Prize really gets the creative juices flowing. And people end up spending more than the $10 million. But there is a huge prestige value, and then the market opens up post that. So
maybe we should have 10 of those.
Yeah.
100 crore challenges, 10 of them.
Yeah.
And I'm telling you, one of them will become a decathon.
And targeting a key problem of India.
Yeah, no, they have to be very focused on big problems.
Yeah. No, great. I think that's great insight, Rajan. Thanks for that. Nidhi, I think we're almost running out of time. That's leveraging of the government. That's what we were talking about. So, Nidhi, there are many companies in the NASSCOM ecosystem which has been actually providing funding, scholarships for the girl child, scholarships for minorities, and so on and so forth. Wouldn't it make sense for an entity like NASSCOM Foundation to actually direct them through the Govtechs like EasyGov, Darshak, and the many others that are there, to actually help them target these constituencies better, rather than them trying to go ahead and target and find out these target entities for which they don't have the data. It's the EasyGovs and the Darshaks which really have the data. So why can't something like that be done?
So that's already happening, you know. It's again one step at a time. But if you look at a lot of organizations which are working, again, whether it's on education or women empowerment or anything, they are working along now with a lot of, if you call them Govtech startups or social enterprises, but there's a lot of collaboration and association happening already onto this thing. In fact, what I mentioned earlier, we ourselves are looking at working in about 40 plus aspirational districts along with a couple of Govtech startups where we are trying to say that if we are talking about digital literacy and skilling, why don't we work with them and take the government.
I hope, Amit, you're listening. Just make sure that you can.
Why don't we take them along with them? So we may not have the infrastructure and the capital to do it ourselves, but along with the CSR support. And so it's basically CSR coming along with the non-profit organizations like us and the ones who are working at the grassroots and certain startups who can come together and bring that, go to a community together. But, in terms of also initiating ideas, we ourselves work on certain challenges, smaller amounts. But, we have worked on health solutions where we are kind of funding low-cost, high-efficiency health startups, and we're working with state governments on providing them test beds. So, already those kind of, it's not only us, there are many other organizations who are doing that. So, already that kind of collaboration is happening, and I think we need to kind of see the people working in the community grassroots do not have the technology and the know-how of how to scale up. It is just that if we collaborate with these startups who are based on technology, we can actually work on more efficient, high-cost, low-cost, effective solutions out here. So that's already on way, and I think you'll hear a lot of us talking about it in the next couple of years. I think, and the pandemic has really helped that in that. Last 2 years has been the game changer for this whole area, for this whole sector. Yeah.
Oh, lovely, lovely. That sounds great. And NASSCOM has always been a leader in that area, so from a tech perspective. So great to see NASSCOM continuing with that leadership. I think we're almost at the end of our discussion because we also need to take a few questions. But last question to you, Anuj. What is your wish list from the government as a Govtech player?
It's data, data, and data. But I'll take maybe two minutes to explain, right? So like Amitabh Kant mentioned in the morning that we are doing large-scale digitization. That means we are generating huge amount of data. So to unlock the value of this data, you need, basically the startups, need to work on this data, create these AI systems which will give you all the analytics, insights, and decisions and recommendations. But as a startup, I can create an algorithm, I can create an AI model, but I need data, right? So government has to open up the data, like what Abhishek mentioned, but there are a lot of issues which we need to solve. The first issue which comes to mind is who owns the IP. For example, the startup has created a AI model, which will be trained on government data. Through the training, basically what I'm doing is I'm extracting the knowledge or learning. In technical terms, you can say it's a correlated weights, which I'm getting. Is this knowledge transferable? For example, I'm working on a health startup where we are creating a disease diagnosis or reducing the patient-doctor communication. If I get access to AIMS, like you were saying, right, I would definitely like to train my algorithm in AIMS, but can I take the learning and sell it to a private hospital, right? Because I should own the IP. If that is the case, I'm sure the investors also should be willing to invest because, understand, converting this data to knowledge to decisions, it's actually a very complex and time-consuming process. It requires a lot of skills. So if I'm putting those much skills, I should be assured that the IP belongs to me. Because the purpose of the government is to actually benefit the citizen, not to make money out of the data. Unlike the private players, who would like to own, control, and monetize data, right? They don't want this knowledge to be transferable to their competition, right? But in case of government, they should come up with a proactive policy saying the IP should belong to the startup, use our data, and then you can monetize it. That's the first thing. The second, I would say, is like we are talking about the data. Data again has various flavors. One is the aggregated data, historical data. Abhishek already mentioned. We are doing a good job in terms of publishing it on MyGov. We need to, of course, make sure that it's real time, up to date. We take care of all the data standardization, data quality issues, so that I'm able to combine that data set with other data sets, right? Because the value comes if I get the railway data set, I get the airlines data set, I get the surface transport data set, then I can create a model which defines this supply-demand gap, and maybe a lot of startups can find out, okay, what solutions you have to do to fix that. So that's the second. The last thing, which is also very important, is about the citizens' data. Because so far what we have talked about is either taking the learning out of the data, not the real data, or working on aggregated anonymized data. But I think in some cases it's important that we also get access to the citizen data, because government has the advantage. They have a verified set of rich verified data about the citizen. Like we have built all these good things in Karnataka. We have a Kutumba, and government is doing a great job in terms of using this data to discover the citizen, their needs, and giving them the benefit. But there are a lot of players in the private also, like big houses or trusts or NGOs or individuals who would also like to contribute and complement, right? But I don't have any way to get access to the data. For example, if I want to, or any big business house want to give a scholarship to 1,000 girl childs who are let's say visually challenged, but who scored 90% in 10th, whose parent income is less than this, they don't have access to the data. So what they do is they take this decision based upon the limited data they have, which may not be the right, So if you are able to pool all the resources together, create a platform, maybe EasyGov can create this platform where the data is available not only to the state governments, but also to the private players who want to, complement the government effort of giving the benefit to the citizen. And of course, there will be all kind of safeguards like consent and making sure that there is enough data lineage. We only use the data for the purpose for which it was allowed. So if you are able to align all these things together, so then you will not only multiply the, you'll be able to, get to the goal of ease of living much faster. But the government also will know that, okay, if I'm already, for example, giving the benefit to this, of course, it's a mutual data sharing. The private person also, party should also tell that, okay, I've given this much benefit to the person. So when you aggregate all those things together, you'll have a big picture, and you exactly know, okay, what, more government need to do, what more the private people do, right? So ultimately, at the end of the day, what we need to do is create this kind of a data sharing platform, or you can call it open data or whatever, so that we are able to freely share the data between government, startups, and private players, so that all of them work together for the benefit of the citizen, right? So that's my only ask, right?
I think that's been a wonderful conversation, very, very scintillating. Thank you so much. We'll open up the forum for questions. I think we'll have time for only 2 questions. So anybody having questions? Sir, please. Sorry, is there a microphone that can be given? The spare one here.
This sharing of data, of course, is extremely important. Now, in agriculture sector also, the agri startups cannot really work till you give them the data. Now, the challenge is that will it increase inequality? Will it trouble some startups? And then, of course, on the second point, what is the responsibility of these agri-techs who are taking data? Can they contribute back to this data set? And I think more acceptability from government point of view would come if these, and I'm of course talking only about agriculture now, if they decide that they would contribute back to the government so that we can then give it to others. I give you, let's say, a land-based data of a farmer with his consent, and you spoke about e-Samati, etc. With the help of this parcels data, you now have satellite data, you make models, you create some value addition. Are you not under obligation to give that data back to the government so that government can function better and perhaps provide to others? Now, you of course will talk about IP. Anuj spoke that they have worked hard, they have taken value out of this, why should they share it back? But then, unless government gets that data back, the first question is, how does government deliver services? And don't you think that the basic core data, without which you just cannot function, and I'm talking about the core data of individual core data, I'm not talking about anonymized data. You make models on the top of the data and tomorrow you don't share it back with the government, then I think government will have problems in sharing that data. So one will have to think about it. The second issue is more of technical issue. We have great giants who will talk in the next session is, can this data, and I know it's difficult to crack, can this data which is given on consent basis to the companies, organizations, not used for other purposes? Now, of course, you will have statutory rules, you will have bodies. Can I have a technical solution? Let's say in e-Samati, for example, I share it for a purpose, I share it for a time. I share it for next 6 months. Now, can there be a mechanism? And the most obvious and simple answer would be no, it is not possible. Can I ensure that the data no more remains with you? Now, obviously, the first answer is not possible, but that's the easier answer. So if we can do that, I think people would be more excited to share data. Now, to say law will not allow you to share now, which law will implement that? I mean, people with impunity will do what they want to do. So if we can evolve some, Sanjay is there, then perhaps something will come out of that.
So just to answer, the first thing, I mean, I totally agree that we need to share it back. I mean, the whole concept of open source community is this only, right? I mean, you take it and then share it back. You contribute it back. So definitely, we need to contribute back to the government. I mean, we call it, we need to announce the data and give it back. And coming to the second, yes, there is a solution, sir, where we can ensure that it is only used for the purpose. So I'll maybe talk to you offline and give you that solution. It's all possible. Thanks.
Do you want to add anything, Abhishek? Anyone else wants to add?
No, I fully agree with sir. Without a legal framework, to expect that in his own goodwill, somebody who has the data will not use it for any purpose, it's not possible. And if any company has taken money from investors and they have to give an ROI on that, they will think of monetizing whatever they can. So without data protection law or without legal framework, to expect that a technology solution will and the moral goodwill will function, it will be too much to expect.
In fact, for the first part that you're mentioning, sir, I'd coined the term mashup systems, wherein the data flows continuously from the public systems to the private systems and back. So they work in a coupled manner, which is why the open API policy becomes very important, because as you rightly said, the data has to flow back also. Otherwise, both lose. Both the government and the private sector lose out. Yeah, totally. Any other questions?
Yeah. So
the gentleman, yeah, okay, why don't you go ahead?
Hi, this is Sumit, founder and CEO of another Govtech startup, RTI Wala. So I have 2 questions, and this question is for both the part of the panels, right at the government, right on the corporate side and left on the government side. So first question for the government side is that we can get the data from the government, state government and central government, but it's
Just
quite...
to clarify, there's only one representative of the government, Abhishek, right now.
Okay. But there are more
We are
stakeholders here.
sim-
Yeah, no worries. So we have the data we can easily access from the central government, the state government, district level offices. But the data from the village level is quite tough for us. Like we have a clients like Reuters, Times Group, then JSW, Tata, and so on. So we are providing the data, the valuable data from the government side. So getting data from the village level, taluk level is still tough. We got and now second question for the Rajan sir. And we got a 15 lakh contract from the government Maharashtra, 35 lakh we are going to get from government of Telangana. And now that you people have to support us not just with the funds, but make us our business model so scalable, so repetitive in nature that if it's not repetitive in India, at least we can you can take us abroad and we can scale it faster. Like that's what we got from Stanford. We recently made it to the Stanford University's STAR program, and they said the problem you are solving is not just for some states or all states of India. It's a problem for all the Asia Pacific and Latin American countries. So that's what kind of support we are looking for.
I would just say that the problem that you mentioned with regard to getting data, it's more difficult to get data from grounds up. Yes, fully agree. In fact, that's not a problem that not only you face, we also face. For example, a simple project like we are implementing presently, Poshan Tracker project for managing nutrition, and Amitabh Kansar mentioned about nutrition. In that, we are supposed to get data from 13 lakh Anganwadi workers across the country. And Anganwadi workers under ICDS scheme, you know, they're very lowly paid, and they work with very bare minimum smartphones if they have. The connectivity across the country is very poor, and we expect them to enter data with regard to every child's presence in the Anganwadi center, their height, their weight, so that we can calculate how many are stunted, how many are wasted. There's all nutrition parameters. So we are finding like out of 13 lakh, 4 lakh Anganwadi workers still entering data regularly. We're working with them, training them in doing that. So one is capacity, second is availability of connectivity, devices, and making systems so simple so that entering data is easier. The UI UX design comes in there. So the challenge is there of getting data from grounds up. We also face. I'm very happy that you don't face challenges at the state level, national level. That's also many of people here will say that is also a problem. So the way things are moving, it will improve. But I agree with your question that getting data from the grounds up is not that easy at the moment.
That's where my point about digital literacy came in. Yeah. Unless you make the rural India digitally literate, you will not get the data.
Plus, in many cases, if I have to get a Gram Panchayat Vikas Adhikari or a BD or a Gram Pradhan or a Anganwadi worker at the last mile to enter data, what's the incentive? What is it for them to do that? If they have to do something more than what they are doing a paper data which they can fudge at the end of the month. So that's the value for them. So until and unless, and the Ministry of WCD is building an incentive model, that if they enter data regularly and if they ensure that if they are entering for 90% of the days in a month, they get an added financial incentive. So those things are designed there. Then we also have problems, like they say connectivity is not there on some days. So we have made a feature of an offline data entry which they can do for 3 days. So some tech solutions, some training solutions, some financial incentives will ensure that we will be able to collect data from grounds up.
Sure. Rajan, do you want to add anything else?
No, I think going back to the discussion we were having, you should figure out how to make money from outside of the government. So it's great that you got the 25 lakh contract from Andhra. I would go get another 25 crores from other states. But then figure out how you can monetize through businesses and consumers. First, you should figure it out in India because like lots of companies say we can't make any money in India, therefore we're going to try to make money outside. That's a bad strategy. Now you could start your company being global from day zero, like a SaaS company, and say we're going to actually focus on the US or Europe or Japan, and we're going to build products for those markets. That's different, like a Freshworks, etc. But if you're an India company that can't figure out how to make money in India, and therefore now you're going to try to focus on other markets, that's not a great. So I would say your number one mandate should be go get another 20 crores of contracts from other states, but then figure out how to monetize. I assume you are, right? Monetizing through corporates, law firms, consumers, etc. And then RTI by itself is probably not a gigantic business. So RTI is really the wedge. So you've got to figure out but now we're brainstorming about your strategy.
Great. Thank you so much. We've completely run out of time, but I think this was an absolutely wonderful conversation. I think there was a lot to learn and pick up, and I'm sure the delegates would have also picked up quite a bit from this conversation. So thank you to each one of you for being here and spending time and sharing your thoughts. Thank you.